Welcome to Just Your Average Employee, the podcast where research meets real life. Join us for actionable insights, digestible advice, and workplace tips tailored to you, the average employee. Today, I'm so happy to have Lindsey Cameron here on the podcast. So among many other distinguished roles, she's currently an assistant professor of management at Wharton Business School and assistant professor in sociology at UPenn. Her research focuses on how artificial intelligence and management led by algorithms are changing the modern workplace with a specific focus on the gig economy. So Lindsey, welcome to Just Your Average Employee.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
So let's jump in and maybe just tell us a little bit about yourself. What led you to start doing the work that you do?
Oh, goodness. You know, I'm a very close, tight-knit family, and my mother lost her job in 2008. You might remember that was the height of the global recession. And my mother had an associate's degree, which is a 2-year degree, and she managed a really large call center that did a back-end processing for ATMs. In age discrimination, I don't know what it's like where you're at, but where I was at and my mom was at in America, age discrimination is real. And she couldn't find a way to re-enter the formal economy. So she did a lot of gig jobs, such as selling food at grocery stores, samples, selling purses at trademarks, working in a warehouse at night. And I really saw how she tried to stay middle class, even though her income was definitely in the lower income segment. And I became interested in downward social mobility. So much of the West is very much obsessed with this idea of upward social mobility, and in particular the American dream. But we all know the real story from economics. Their real wages continue to fall. And more people are in situations like my mom. So that became my interest in round downward social mobility. And it happened to be that many people, to make ends meet after a layoff, were working for a company like Uber or Lyft, doing the more what we call today gig economy. And that became my research interest. And for my mom, luckily after 8 years, everything worked out. She re-entered the traditional labor force. And now she's retired and loving her grandkids. So a happy ending there.
That's so good. It's so interesting to hear what has inspired each sort of researcher, because I think we all have these stories that make us question why are things the way they are and how can we make them better. And in this case, I feel like so much of your research speaks to the problems that there are in the gig economy and other parts of the economy and what needs to be done and what kinds of questions need to be asked. And sort of based on that, what are some of the questions that you find most fascinating or the things that you have come across that really inspire you or you found interest in over this time of researching the topics you research?
I mean, the gig economy is fascinating. You have this little app that's on your phone, more power than put a man on a moon, and it somehow is connecting workers and customers in all these ways that have unanticipated consequences. So a lot of my research is looking at these unanticipated consequences. How do workers find autonomy when they're under an algorithmic system that's so strong that some people call it an invisible cage? How do workers make sense during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic and they were called heroes all of a sudden in the United States for doing grocery delivery? How do people make sense of this narrative that's moralizing work that is underpaid and often very risky and dangerous? So a lot of my research, again, as I'm mentioning, is looking at these unintended consequences of when we digitize this work that was previously much more informal.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. So with that, I want to sort of jump in. And basically the areas that I wanted to focus on is looking at this employee angle of how the gig economy and other areas that you're looking at impact the individual worker. I know that a lot of the work that you do really looks at problems at the economy level or specific organizations, what's wrong with the system itself, which I think is very interesting. And I think it also is important to shine a light so that the employees can see that those are problems that they should be looking out for. At the same time, I also want sort of the average employee to be able to have information that to them is digestible and they can sort of not only see the problems, but maybe find temporary solutions in the meantime while they're dealing with potentially, such as your mom was, trying to sort of make ends meet before something sort of better comes along. So one of your many areas of expertise I mentioned is the gig economy, which is what I really want to focus on today. And the gig economy makes up roughly 36% of the U.S. workforce, and it's growing exponentially at a rate 3 times faster than the total U.S. workforce. And so in light of this dramatic shift, I really want to emphasize how gig workers can learn to use the insights that you have found in your research to sort of make the best of this type of work, and maybe at the same time also ask questions about what they can change or what needs to be changed on a broader scale. So we'll cover things like meaning in work and also potentially mindfulness, and how mindfulness can be one way that employees can sort of find autonomy or feel that in the interim they're able to make the situation better for themselves.
No, you really succinctly laid out the situation. I mean, often in these platforms, the money, the value, the power accumulates to the platform in the middle. But that's from a system perspective. You know, there are many individuals who choose to enter gig work either because it's the best option that's available to them. It can be a push-pull dynamic of why they enter. And so the question is, how do you make the best of it? So some of my research looks at the games that individuals play. So they're human. It's one of the ways that we stay engaged. We can stay interested in our work, particularly when work is very monotonous. There's research on folks who are on assembly lines who would like hide bananas back and forth as a way to pass the time and make it more interesting. So some of the games I found people in the ride-hailing industry playing, one was called the relational game. So that's, how do I have the most satisfying relationship with the customer? So some people would decorate their cars literally with unicorn decals. I went into this woman's car and it felt like I was back in my bedroom from when I was like in middle school. Or they would purposely seed conversations with customers to have a more value-rich conversation. There was one gentleman who saw driving an Uber meant it was his time to teach white people about blacks and race in America, and had a lot of adverbs about the Black Lives Movement and men who have been murdered by police. And so in the relational game, it's all about how do I create a great relationship with the customer, and then you can see the rating at the end and you can see the compliments. So you can get a sense. Compliments are these little like stars or badges you get for doing a great job. So you can see here how playing the relational game is like an alignment with what the organization wants you to do and the way the app is designed, and it keeps workers engaged. Now, another way that workers made meetings, what's called the efficiency game. And the efficiency game is not about how do I create the best relationship with the customer, it's how do I beat the algorithm. And these people would create these elaborate spreadsheets about where's the best place to go into the city and when will there be a higher surge amount, and going onto Facebook and other types of social media apps to get the lowdown about when there would be high demand in particular areas. So they're very motivated by this incentive to win in the system. The issue, I think the sticky point with playing the efficiency game is, yes, it keeps workers very engaged because it's something that they can sort of move or try to win the game, but the user interface system isn't designed in a way for people to actually know whether or not they're winning. Oftentimes in these companies, you don't even know what your actual take-home net pay is. It's unclear if you actually got the full surge amount for a ride. So individuals in both games, the relational game and the efficiency game, were engaged. It made the work better than people who weren't playing a game at all. But ultimately, individuals who were playing the efficiency game had a sense of dis-ease because they weren't sure if they could ever win. So they were engaged, but were also feeling uneasy on the terms. So that's to my point of different ways about how you can make the work have more meaning involved, is to think about ways to make it a game, but also don't forget who's actually winning the game and who sets the terms of who wins the game.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's such a great point. So just to reiterate, there's two ways that the game can be played. One is this relational, and so trying to either, decorate your car or have these meaningful relationships with customers. The other is sort of trying to beat the system and almost treating it really like a game. But I think you point out so well that at the end of the day, it doesn't change the dynamics of the work that is actually being done and potentially these structural issues. So I'm wondering if you have any advice on how to balance that, both being aware of, okay, these are things I can do maybe in the meantime to pass the time, but also just based on, your research and your conversations with these drivers, keeping in mind that this isn't the best job in the long term and there are ways that I am being potentially taken advantage of, and I need to sort of also balance that. Is there a way even to balance that, I guess, is the question.
It's what I call this the good bad job in my research. That sometimes you're choosing from a set of bad options and you're just trying to make the best choice. And I think for some people, some types of gig work are this type of job. And I think the answer of just to make sure that you're not waking up in 10 years and this is still the main type of work that you're doing. And I think very often in my research, I see that people really enjoy the fact that they have more schedule flexibility than they would have in a traditional job. And because of that, they can stay in this system of work for longer and longer. And in particular, in companies like ride hailing or food delivery where you don't set the wages. It's no drivers that nobody I've ever interviewed, and I've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people, are making more money today than they were 2, 3, or 4 years now. So I think it's thinking about more at a broader sense about where one's work life is going to, like, yes, this can be a great option for the short term, but to not necessarily let it be one's long-term plan.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so kind of just reminding oneself, okay, these are sort of potentially the negatives, the downsides of this job, and I need to keep these in mind so that in the future, in the long term, I can be somewhere beyond where I am today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but there are definitely ways to make it more enjoyable and meaningful in the short term. And I think that's what things like the relational game very much do. There are other ways where people do a cognitive reframing of the work. There's someone who I spoke to whose son had been killed by a drunk driver and really enjoyed driving for ride-hailing companies because he gave him that opportunity to sort of, particularly he drove on Friday and Saturday night because it gave him the chance to take people home who were inebriated. So all of these types of cognitive reframing and games are good. But again, this person actually had a plan for himself, and in 3 years, he had transitioned to different work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. And I think that is definitely something to keep front of mind, is that it's important to find meaning. It's important to feel that happiness in the meantime. But of course, you also want to advance in the long term. And I feel like that sort of shifts into potentially looking at some other angles of your work. So I know one area that you look at is mindfulness. So I'm just curious to hear about your work in that area and how it can particularly help the average employee.
So I came to mindfulness many, many years ago. I served in Iraq, and so mindfulness was one of the ways that I was able to, cope with being in a deployment in a war zone and stressful situations away from home. And so since then, I have a very deep meditation practice and have a community. And some of my research does focus on how you can implement mindfulness interventions and what I would consider high-stress jobs. So in this case, it's call center work, which is, folks on the phone can be really rude when they're calling into a call center to get some of their problems addressed. You're often under heavy amounts of technical surveillance about how quickly you need to turn around calls and things like this. And so in this research, I look at, can a mindfulness intervention actually have an effect and change the way people approach work and the way they show up to work?
Okay, and what did you find in that work?
So this was actually a very large field experiment. So where individuals had the opportunity to meditate or listen to a book about meditation or to listen to the news or do nothing at all. Those are, in research terms, all called active control. And we found individuals who were able to do this was a 5-minute meditation, and they did it for over the course of 2 weeks, so every day for 5 minutes. We found that they were more likely to help their colleagues, so interpersonal helping, which of course you can imagine that extending to possibly helping other individuals on the phone. And what we found was really, I feel like, most impactful was not just, obviously there's a cumulative effect of meditating a little bit every day, but what is extremely powerful is how do you integrate mindfulness into one's work day. And so for these individuals in the call center, we had called an on-the-spot mindfulness moment, and that was right before they picked up the phone to call someone to take 3 breaths, or the same if someone was calling and the phone was ringing, to take 3 breaths. And so thinking about how this research could benefit the average worker, which is sort of the theme of our chat today, is thinking about what's part of your everyday life. If you're maybe a teacher at a nursery school or something like that, it could be right before you walk into the classroom or when you drop the children off to the bathroom. It could be if you're a cook, it could be the few minutes where you're waiting for something to the water to boil and you take 3 breaths. You have to think about a way about what is something that you already do in your life and where is a way that you can do it with deeper intention and clarity and purpose.
No, that's amazing. I think I love this sort of micro intervention as well because, the average employee already has so much going on, everything that is demanding at work, but also everything in your personal life and just trying to find time to do everything. I think it becomes daunting to then say, well, I'd like to make some changes, but I don't know where to start. So you sort of continue with the status quo. And this idea of saying you don't have to change anything about your day, but you do need to find sort of 5 seconds to take a breath. I think that can be really powerful.
Exactly. I mean, so many people think that mindfulness you need to sign up for like a 10-day Vipassana retreat, and not everybody has the luxury to do something like that. And so the first thing is to set the intention about, okay, this is something I want to try. And then thinking about what is something that you do with routine in your day and which you can put in something very small. There's things as simple as like, how do some people when they pray the rosary, that's a moment of clarity or, reflection. It can be when you cook. It can be while you're waiting to pick up your kid from school and you have that 2 to 3 minutes while you're waiting for them to come out. So it's thinking about where in your extra day can you take a moment and just be.
That's really powerful. So we're kind of nearing the end of our chat. We've heard a little bit about the issues with the gig economy, the ways that gig workers, especially in the ride-hailing industry, can sort of deal with these issues, at least in the short term, by playing games. We've now discussed a little bit about mindfulness and how it can be helpful, even just this sort of microdose of mindfulness. And I kind of want to end off on just boiling all of that down to sort of a key takeaway. Our listeners, the average employee, what would be the main piece of advice that you would give them today?
Be here, look around. And I think so much about the mindfulness research and the games we talked about is how do you make the best in the present moment with what you have? If it's playing a game, if it's breathing, if it's joking with the customers and making sure you have bottled water for them. But to not lose fact of what are the larger systems that are around you. Mindfulness, call center work is hard. The mindfulness work is a microdose intervention, but it's not a panacea for some of the, panopticon structures that are around call center work. Similar when you think about ride hailing. So, but as an individual agent, there are things that you can do to sort of safeguard your well-being and to care for others and to sort of not lose sight of the larger structural systems that are around us at the same time.
Okay, well, that is such a great way to leave off. Thank you so much, Lindsey, for your time, and I'm sure our listeners have loved hearing all your insight.
Thank you for having me again.